The train shuddered, a rhythmic pulse of steel on steel that beat like a metronome, counting down the miles across the baked expanse of the Texas plains. Outside, the world was a palette of ochre and rust, a landscape of raw, unfinished earth, clawed by sun and wind. Heat shimmered above the alkali flats, making the distant mesas dance like ghosts on the horizon. Inside the private car, the air was thick with the scent of polished mahogany and old leather. Scarlet Hayes watched the desolate scenery slide past her reflection, a pale, serious ghost in the window pane. Her father, Judge Thomas Hayes, sat opposite her, his head bowed over a stack of documents bound in legal tape. His face, usually a mask of judicial calm, was etched with a profound weariness. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, the silver at his temples more pronounced. "It is a harsh country," he said without looking up, as if reading her thoughts. "It demands a certain kind of fortitude. It's honest," Scarlett replied, her voice quiet but firm. "Boston society is filled with shadows and whispers. Out here, the dangers are in plain sight." The judge finally raised his eyes. They were a deep, clear gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held the weight of 1,000 difficult decisions. He had spent 30 years on the bench, a bulwark of federal law in a territory that often preferred its own brutal code. This trip, he'd explained, was the culmination of his life's work, delivering the evidence that would finally dismantle the empire of a man known only as Silas Kane. A man so elusive, so ruthlessly efficient, he was more myth than outlaw, the ghost of the Cimarron. The honesty can be just as deadly as deceit, Scarlett, he cautioned. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and drew out a small velvet pouch. "I want you to keep this." He tipped the contents into his palm. It was a silver locket tarnished with age, its surface intricately engraved with the delicate forms of intertwined ivy. It was simple, elegant, and deeply familiar. It had belonged to her mother and her mother's mother before that. "Father, I can't. This is yours." "Nonsense. It belongs to the women of this family." He unclasped the chain and reached across the table. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he fastened it around her neck. The cool metal was a startling weight against her skin. "Your mother would have wanted you to have it. She believed it was a talisman, a ward against the shadows you so dislike." He settled back into his seat, his gaze lingering on the locket. "In times of chaos, we cling to the things that remind us who we are. That locket is a map back to our family, to our history. Don't ever lose it." A strange premonition, cold and sharp, pricked at Scarlett's skin. The gravity in her father's voice felt like a final testament. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels seemed to slow the landscape outside, holding its breath. Further down the train, in the smoky haze of the passenger car, Jackson Jack Cole watched the world through half-lidded eyes. He looked like just another drifter, his face shadowed by the brim of a sweat-stained hat, his duster coated in the dust of a dozen forgotten towns. But his stillness was deceptive. It was the coiled stillness of a predator. His gaze missed nothing, the nervous sweat on the conductor's brow, the two men at the far end of the car, who didn't look like ranchers the way the train's speed was decreasing on a flat, straight stretch of track. He was a bounty hunter now, a man who traded in the lives of others because his own had lost its value long ago. He was on this train for a simple job transporting a petty swindler to the marshal in El Paso. But his instincts, honed over years of wearing a U.S. Marshal's star, were screaming that something was deeply wrong. The air itself had grown heavy, charged with an unseen current. The screech of brakes was sudden and violent, a shriek of tortured metal that threw passengers from their seats. A collective gasp was swallowed by the shattering of glass as the windows on both sides of the car exploded inward. The two men who weren't ranchers were on their feet instantly, rifles appearing from beneath their ponchos. Gunfire erupted, a deafening cacophony of chaos and panic. Jack was already moving his body, reacting before his mind had fully processed the assault. He shoved his own prisoner to the floor, drawing the Colt Peacemaker from his hip in a single fluid motion. He wasn't a lawman anymore, but the muscle memory remained. Protect the innocent, neutralize the threat. The attack was too coordinated, too precise for common bandits. Men swarmed the train from both sides, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas. They moved with military discipline, ignoring the cowering passengers and their valuables, heading directly for the front of the train. For the private car. In that car, Judge Hayes had pushed Scarlett to the floor behind his heavy oak desk. "Stay down, no matter what you hear," he commanded, his voice the unwavering baritone of the courtroom. He produced a small derringer from his coat, a pitiful defense against the storm outside. The doors splintered, kicked open with a single powerful blow. A tall figure filled the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun. He was dressed in black from his boots to his wide-brimmed hat. He held a silver-plated revolver, and he moved with an unnerving grace, his presence radiating a chilling authority that silenced the chaos around him. This was no common outlaw. This was a king surveying his domain. "Judge Hayes," the man said, his voice surprisingly articulate, almost cultured. It carried a strange melodic cadence, like a preacher delivering a sermon of damnation. "We meet at last." He stepped into the car, his men fanning out behind him. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept the room, ignoring the sealed box of evidence on the table. They landed on the judge, then moved lower, fixing on the empty space on his waistcoat where the locket's chain had rested moments before. "You have something that belongs to me," the man said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "I have nothing of yours, Kane." The judge replied, his hand tightening on the derringer. Silas Kane smiled, a cold, mirthless expression that did not reach his eyes. "Don't you?" A small silver locket, ivy engraved on the front, a token of a debt long past due. From her hiding place, Scarlett felt the blood freeze in her veins. The locket. He wasn't here for the evidence. He was here for her mother's locket. "I don't know what you're talking about." The judge bluffed, his body a shield between the outlaw and his hidden daughter. Kane's smile vanished. "Lies were always your trade, weren't they, Judge?" In the courtroom and out. "You build careers on them. You ruin lives with them." He took another step forward. "Give it to me. Now." A struggle. A desperate, hopeless movement from her father. A single deafening gunshot that seemed to tear the world in two. Judge Hayes crumpled his body, slumping to the floor with a heavy finality. The derringer clattered uselessly from his hand. Father Scarlett's scream was a raw, broken thing. She scrambled out from behind the desk, oblivious to the danger, her entire universe collapsing into the sight of her father's still form. Kane turned, his gaze falling upon her. For a moment he seemed surprised. Then his eyes dropped to her neck, to the silver locket resting against her collarbone. He moved toward her, his steps unhurried. He knelt, not looking at her father's body, but at her. His face was lean, almost ascetic, with high cheekbones, and an intensity in his eyes that was more fanatic than thief. He reached out, and his fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed against her throat as he took the locket. He didn't rip it away. He unclasped it, as if performing a solemn ritual. As his eyes met hers, she saw it. Not greed, not malice. It was a chilling personal hatred, an agony so deep it had curdled into pure vengeance. He held the locket in his palm, closing his fist around it, as if holding the heart of his enemy. "The debt is paid," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Then, without another glance, he stood and walked out of the car, his men melting away into the dust and chaos as quickly as they had appeared. Scarlett was left alone, the silence ringing in her ears, the metallic scent of blood filling the air. She crawled to her father, cradling his head in her lap, her tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. The evidence box, the supposed reason for this entire journey, sat untouched. Her father hadn't been murdered for justice or for greed. He had been executed for a piece of silver, for a history she didn't understand. In that moment, her grief hardened into something cold and sharp. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a witness. and she would find out why. The nearest town was a place called Redemption, a name so steeped in irony it felt like a deliberate cruelty. It was little more than a single dusty street, gasping for life between two sun-scorched mesas. The law was a part-time sheriff whose authority extended only as far as the bottom of his whiskey glass. He listened to Scarlett's account with a glazed-over disinterest, scribbling a few illegible notes before declaring the matter a federal affair and pointing her toward the telegraph office. Frustration burned like bile in Scarlett's throat. The system her father had dedicated his life to was a slow, bureaucratic beast, and Silas Kane was a phantom who would be gone long before the wheels of justice began to turn. She needed a different kind of justice. Faster. Sharper. She found him in the back of the saloon, nursing a glass of amber liquid that smelled like regret. Jackson Cole. During the chaos on the train, while others had screamed or cowered, he had moved with a deadly purpose that spoke of a past he clearly wanted to forget. He had taken down 2 of Kane's men before they could enter the passenger car, his actions swift, efficient, and utterly devoid of hesitation. He was the only person on that train who had seemed remotely competent. He looked up as she approached his eyes, a startlingly pale blue in his sun-weathered face. They were tired eyes, haunted by things he refused to speak of. "Mr. Cole," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "My name is Scarlett Hayes. I was in the private car on the train." He gave a curt nod, his gaze dropping back to his glass. "I know who you are. Sorry for your loss." The words were automatic, a well-worn platitude delivered without emotion. "I need to hire you," she said, getting straight to the point. "I want you to find the man who killed my father." Silas Kane. The name hung in the air between them. For a fraction of a second, the mask of indifference on Jack's face slipped. A flicker of something recognition, dread a ghost of a memory passed through his eyes before he walled it off again. He took a slow drink, setting the glass down with a definitive click. "No." The flat refusal caught her off guard. "I can pay you, whatever your price." "It's not about the money, Miss Hayes." He finally looked at her again, his expression grim. "Some ghosts are best left alone. He's not a ghost. He's a man. A man who murdered my father for a locket and left a fortune in federal evidence untouched. I need to know why. The law won't be fast enough. You are." His refusal was so adamant, so visceral, it was clear this was more than just a job he was turning down. It was personal. "Kane's not my business anymore." He said, his voice low and final. "Find another bounty hunter." He stood, threw a coin on the bar, and walked out, leaving Scarlett standing in the stale, smoky air of the saloon. Her last hope had just walked out the door. But as she watched him disappear into the searing sunlight, his words echoed in her mind. Not my business anymore. That meant it once was his business. The connection was there, buried deep, and she would dig it up with or without his help. Scarlett spent the next 2 days in Redemption's telegraph office, wiring her father's associates in Washington and San Antonio. The replies were slow in coming, filled with condolences and promises of action that felt hollow and distant. She knew she couldn't wait. Kane was getting further away with every tick of the clock. Her father had been meticulous. Among his belongings, she found a small, leather-bound journal filled with his precise, elegant script. It contained everything he had gathered on Silas Kane witness testimonies, maps of suspected territories, notes on his methods. It was a blueprint of a ghost, and it was her only inheritance. One entry caught her eye, a reference to a small, nearly abandoned mining town called Purgatory Flats, a place Kane had allegedly used as a hideout years ago. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead she had. She bought a horse, a stubborn, wiry mare with a mean look in her eye and a used saddle. She packed what little she had, her father's journal, a canteen, and the Colt revolver she'd taken from a dead guard on the train. She had never fired a gun in her life, but the solid weight of it in her saddlebag was a small comfort. Leaving redemption, and she felt a terrifying, exhilarating sense of freedom. She was utterly alone, chasing a killer into a land that swallowed people whole. The heat was a physical presence, the sun a hammer against the anvil of the sky. The landscape was brutal and magnificent, a place of stark, unforgiving beauty. She followed the crude map in her father's journal, her mind a sharp, focused instrument, just as he had taught her. Logic, observation, deduction. These were the tools he had given her, and she would use them to find his killer. For 3 days she rode. The initial terror gave way to a grim determination. She learned the rhythm of the trail, the language of the silence, the subtle signs of water and danger. On the 4th day, she found the canyon trail that led to Purgatory Flats. The air grew still, the silence unnatural. The same feeling she'd had on the train just before the attack. Her mare shied, ears twitching. A glint of metal from the ridge above. A trap. 3 men materialized from the rocks, rifles leveled. They wore the same dusty bandanas as Kane's men. "Well, look what we have here." One of them sneered, his eyes raking over her. A little lamb lost from the flock. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face a mask of calm. "I'm just a traveler. I mean you no harm." "That's Judge Hayes's girl," another one said, his voice sharp with recognition. Kane said she was a witness. The first man's grin widened. "Looks like our loyalty is about to be rewarded. Get down off the horse, girl." Slowly, she knew she had only one chance. As she swung her leg over the saddle, her hand darted into her saddlebag, fingers closing around the cold steel of the Colt. She drew it, turning as she hit the ground, the weapon feeling impossibly heavy and clumsy in her hand. She never had a chance to fire. A rifle butt slammed into her shoulder, sending a blinding shock of pain through her body and knocking the gun from her grasp. She fell to her knees, the dust tasting of grit and defeat. The man stood over her, raising his rifle to bring the stock down on her head. A gunshot cracked through the canyon, sharp and definitive. Not from the man above her. The outlaw stiffened, a look of pure surprise on his face, before a dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He toppled backward like a felled tree. Before the other 2 could react, 2 more shots echoed in rapid succession. The second man fell, clutching his throat. The third spun around, firing wildly into the rocks, and was met with a bullet that threw him against the canyon wall. Silence descended, absolute and ringing. From behind a cluster of boulders, Jack Cole emerged, smoke curling from the barrel of his peacemaker. He moved with the same lethal economy she remembered from the train, his face a hard, unreadable mask. He didn't look at her. He walked to each of the fallen men, checking to make sure they were dead, with a detached professionalism that was more chilling than any rage. He finally turned to her, holstering his weapon. "What in God's name did you think you were doing out here alone?" he demanded, his voice rough with anger. Scarlett pushed herself to her feet, clutching her bruised shoulder. "What you refused to do." "I was looking for Kane." "You were looking to get yourself killed," he shot back. He kicked at the dust near one of the bodies. "These are Kane's vultures. They clean up his messes. He must have left them behind to make sure there were no loose ends." He looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than anger showed in his eyes. A grudging respect, perhaps. "How did you find this place?" "My father kept a journal." Jack ran a hand over his face, the gesture weary and resigned. He looked up at the sky, then back at her, a man defeated by his own conscience. "Damn it," he muttered. He had followed her. He had seen her leave redemption and couldn't let her ride to her death. The ghost he wanted to leave alone had found him anyway. "All right, Miss Hayes." He sighed, the fight going out of him. "You want to hunt a ghost? Fine. But you do it my way. From this moment on, you listen to everything I say. You do everything I do. And you don't ask questions I'm not prepared to answer. Are we clear?" "Perfectly," Scarlett said, her voice betraying none of the profound relief that washed over her. An uneasy alliance was forged in that bloody canyon, born of his guilt and her resolve. Their journey continued, but now it was a shared one. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. Jack was a closed book, his past locked away behind a wall of cynicism. He taught her how to survive in the wild, how to make a smokeless fire, how to read the terrain, how to handle the colt with a steady hand. He was a patient, if reluctant, teacher. In return, Scarlett shared the contents of her father's journal. As she read the entries aloud by the firelight each night, a portrait of Silas Kane began to emerge. He wasn't a common thief. His robberies were strategic, targeting men and institutions connected to a series of legal cases from a decade prior. He was a man obsessed not with wealth, but with some form of twisted justice. One night, Jack was cleaning his pistol when Scarlett read a passage describing Kane's strange habit of leaving a single white feather at the scene of his crimes. Jack's hands froze. A muscle in his jaw tightened. "What is it?" Scarlett asked, noticing his reaction. Nothing, he said too quickly. But later that night, she was woken by a strangled cry. She saw him across the campfire, caught in the grip of a nightmare. His body was tense, his hands clenched into fists. He muttered a name, a single word, lost in a pained whisper. "Daniel." He woke with a gasp, his eyes wide and haunted. He saw her watching him, and the mask slammed back into place. He got up and walked into the darkness, leaving her with another piece of a puzzle she couldn't solve. The name Daniel. The white feather. The ghost he refused to speak of. They were all connected, and she was beginning to suspect the key to it all lay buried in Jack Cole's past. After a week of hard travel, they reached the town of Silver Creek. It was a marginal improvement on Redemption, a struggling community clinging to a depleted silver vein. The law was a man named Sheriff Miller, a gregarious, folksy man with a welcoming smile and a potbelly that spoke of a comfortable life. He listened to their story, a carefully edited version that painted them as survivors seeking refuge with genuine sympathy. "Silas Kane," he said, shaking his head. "That name brings a chill with it. We haven't had any trouble with him here, thank the Lord. You two are welcome to stay as long as you need. Get yourselves cleaned up. Rest. My town is your town." He offered them shelter, resources, and advice. He seemed a bastion of stability in a chaotic world. But as they spoke, his questions, though couched in friendly concern, were a little too specific. "So you're heading east from here, I'd wager, back to civilized lands?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. "Something like that," Jack answered evasively, his gaze unreadable. Miller clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, you let me know your route. I can tell you which trails are safest. Wouldn't want you running into any more trouble." The sheriff's hospitality felt genuine, but Scarlett couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Her father had taught her to observe the details. She noticed the way Miller's eyes never quite met hers, the slight tremor in his hand as he poured them coffee, the new expensive-looking rifle leaning in the corner of his otherwise modest office. They were small things, but in this deadly game, small things mattered. Jack's instincts were screaming louder. He recognized the rifle. It was a custom Sharps, the kind favored by discerning marksmen. The kind Silas Kane's most trusted lieutenant was known to carry. That night, Jack and Scarlett studied the journal again in the privacy of their boarding house room. A faded map was tucked into a pocket at the back. It detailed the area around Silver Creek, with a circle drawn around a location marked only as the Sanctuary. It was an old ghost town abandoned after the Silver Rush. A perfect place for a ghost to hide. Purgatory Flats was a bust, Scarlett said. But this feels different. The map was hidden. "We'll go at first light," Jack decided, his voice low. "We won't tell Miller." His distrust of the cheerful sheriff confirmed Scarlett's own suspicions. They were on their own, surrounded by enemies who wore the masks of friends. The ghost town was a skeleton picked clean by wind and time. Weather-beaten structures sagged like tired old men, their windowless eyes staring out at the desolate landscape. It was a place of profound silence, a graveyard of forgotten dreams. Jack and Scarlett moved through the deserted streets like specters themselves, weapons drawn every sense on high alert. They found the hideout in the old assayer's office, the only building with a reinforced door. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of dust and something else. Obsession. There was no stolen gold, no stacks of cash. Instead, the room was a shrine. Dozens of newspaper clippings were tacked to the walls, all detailing the career of Judge Thomas Hayes and another man, U.S. Marshal Jackson Cole. In the center of the room, on a small crude table, sat a single object. Under a glass dome, a child's worn leather ball. Next to it was a faded daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame. Scarlett picked it up. It showed a woman with tired, sad eyes and a young boy of about 10, his face bright with an innocent smile. Another older boy stood beside them, his arm protectively around his brother, his expression already hard and defiant. The woman in the photograph was wearing a silver locket with ivy engraved on the front. "It's him," Scarlett whispered, recognizing the older boy's intense eyes. "It's Kane." Her gaze shifted to the table to another newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline was "Stark Marshal's Raid Ends in Tragedy, Innocent Boy Killed in Crossfire." The article detailed a botched raid on a suspected gang hideout, led by Marshal Jack Cole. During the shootout, the younger brother of a suspect, a 10-year-old boy named Daniel Kane, had been killed by a stray bullet. The official inquiry, presided over by Judge Thomas Hayes, had cleared Marshal Cole of any wrongdoing, ruling the death a tragic but unavoidable accident. The room began to spin. The locket. Daniel. The nightmares. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. Scarlett turned to Jack, the photograph trembling in her hand. His face was ashen, his eyes fixed on the picture of the two boys. The ghost he'd been running from for a decade had finally caught him. "Tell me," she demanded, her voice a raw whisper. Jack sank onto a nearby crate, the strength seeming to drain from his legs. The tough, cynical bounty hunter was gone, replaced by a man drowning in a sea of guilt. His name was Daniel. He began, his voice raspy, broken. "We were raiding a gang of horse thieves. Silas, he was just a kid, and then barely 16, had fallen in with them. Daniel wasn't involved. He was just there visiting his brother. When the shooting started, he got scared. He ran." Jack stared at his hands, as if seeing the gun that had fired the fatal shot. It was chaos. Smoke, shouting. "I saw a figure running with a gun. I fired. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know he was a child until he fell." He looked up at Scarlett, his pale blue eyes swimming with a pain so profound it stole her breath. "It cost me everything. My badge. My soul. The department wanted it quiet. A dead outlaw's brother. No one cared." Judge Hayes presided over the inquiry. He buried it. Called it a justifiable accident to protect the marshal's office from scandal. The full, horrifying truth crashed down on Scarlett. Kane wasn't a common outlaw. He was a man consumed by a singular burning purpose: revenge. Revenge against the man who pulled the trigger and the man who used the law to cover it up. Her father hadn't been a random victim. He was a specific target. And Jack was the centerpiece of it all. "He's not hunting money, is he?" Scarlett said the words, feeling like ice in her mouth. "He's hunting you. He's hunting the men who took his brother and denied him justice." Jack corrected, his voice hollow. "And he won't stop until we're both in the ground." The revelation in the ghost town had changed everything. They weren't hunting a killer anymore. They were the hunted. Their only hope was to turn the tables, to set a trap and end this before Kane could. "He'll come back here," Jack said, his mind already working, the marshal's instincts taking over. "This place is sacred to him. We can use that." They returned to Silver Creek under the cover of darkness, their minds racing. They needed supplies, ammunition, and a plan that left no room for error. Their biggest liability was Sheriff Miller. They knew he couldn't be trusted, but they could use his treachery to their advantage. The next morning, they walked into the sheriff's office, putting on a performance of weary defeat. "We're done," Jack announced, slumping into a chair. "This is a fool's errand. We found another of Kane's camps, but it was empty. He's long gone." Scarlett played her part, her face a mask of disappointment. "We're leaving town, heading east on the morning stage. There's nothing more we can do here." Sheriff Miller's face was a study in practiced sympathy. "I'm sorry to hear that, son. You gave it your best. The east road is clear. You should have a safe journey." They knew he would send word to Kane the moment they left his office. Their supposed departure would lull Kane into a false sense of security, making him believe his pursuers had given up. He would return to his sanctuary, to the shrine of his murdered brother, and they would be waiting for him. They bought 2 tickets for the morning stage, making a public show of their departure. But as the stagecoach rumbled out of town, Jack and Scarlett slipped away, circling back through the wooded hills. They spent the rest of the day gathering what they needed: extra ammunition, water, and medical supplies. As dusk settled, they made their way back toward the ghost town, moving with a stealth Jack had taught her. But as they neared the edge of town, the trap they had so carefully laid sprang shut on them. A voice called out from the shadows of the livery stable, "Leaving so soon." Sheriff Miller stepped into the moonlight, flanked by 4 grim-faced men holding rifles. He was no longer the folksy, smiling lawman. His face was hard, his eyes cold and calculating. "You were smarter than I gave you credit for," Miller said, a sneer twisting his lips. "But not smart enough. Did you really think I wouldn't have you watched?" The betrayal was a cold, hard knot in Scarlett's stomach. They had been played from the moment they arrived in Silver Creek. "Kane pays well," Miller continued, answering their unspoken question. "Better than this town ever did. Drop your weapons." Slowly, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, they had no choice. Their guns thudded softly in the dust. "What now, Miller?" Jack asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Now," the sheriff said with a chilling smile, "Mr. Kane would like a word with you. He has a special reunion planned, an ambush." They were herded at gunpoint toward the old abandoned silver mine at the edge of the territory, a place of collapsed tunnels and treacherous shafts known as the Devil's Maw. As they were marched through the darkness, the sky began to boil. Distant thunder rumbled a low growl that promised violence. The wind picked up, whipping dust and grit into their faces, tasting of regret and impending doom. They were forced into the main entrance of the mine, the air immediately growing cold and damp, smelling of wet rock and decay. Just inside, a lantern cast flickering, distorted shadows against the rough-hewn walls. Silas Kane was waiting for them. He stood with his back to them, obsessively polishing the silver locket with a cloth. He turned slowly, his face illuminated by the lantern light. His eyes burned with the fire of a zealot, Marshal Cole. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Welcome. I apologize for the rustic accommodations, but I find the dark is conducive to honesty." Lightning flashed outside, momentarily illuminating the labyrinth of tunnels branching off into the darkness. A clap of thunder followed so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. The storm had arrived. "You made a mistake leaving me alive," Kane. Scarlett said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. Kane's gaze shifted to her. "No, Miss Hayes. Leaving you alive was not a mistake. It was a message. A testament to the world that my quarrel was not with you, but with the corrupt system your father represented." He took a step closer to Jack. "He told you it was an accident, didn't he? A tragic miscalculation in the heat of battle." That's the story he told the world. The story he probably told himself to sleep at night. "It was an accident," Jack growled, his hands clenched into fists. Was it? Kane's voice was a silken whisper of venom. My brother was 10 years old. He was unarmed. He was running away from the gunfire. You shot him in the back. An execution, Marshal. You executed a child, and your friend the judge signed a piece of paper that washed the blood from your hands. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place. The cover-up wasn't just to avoid a scandal. It was to hide a murder. Jack flinched as if struck, the carefully constructed wall around his guilt crumbling to dust. He had told himself for 10 years it was a stray bullet, an accident. But deep down, had he always known the truth? Kane turned his attention back to Scarlett. Your father read the reports. He knew the angle of the bullet. He knew my brother was running away. But a dead Indian boy was worth less than the reputation of a federal marshal. So he buried the truth. Your father didn't just deny my family justice. He stole the truth of my brother's last moments. That is a debt that gold cannot repay. A sudden, powerful gust of wind from the storm outside extinguished the lantern, plunging the mine into absolute darkness. In the same instant, Jack moved. He threw himself at Scarlett, pushing her toward one of the dark tunnels just as gunfire erupted from Miller's men. Splinters of rock exploded from the wall where they had been standing. The climax was not a negotiation. It was a descent into chaos. The mine became their tomb and their battleground. The darkness was total, broken only by the brief, blinding flashes of lightning that stabbed through the entrance, creating a disorienting strobe effect of shadow and light. The thunder was a constant rolling barrage that masked the sound of footsteps and cocking hammers. Jack and Scarlett scrambled deeper into the unstable tunnels, the air growing colder, thinner. Stay close. Jack hissed his hand, finding hers in the dark. And don't make a sound. It was a tense, brutal game of cat and mouse. They were hunted through the echoing darkness, the shouts of Kane and his men bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. The mine itself was an enemy. Loose rocks crumbled underfoot. The wooden support beams groaned under the strain of the mountain, threatening to collapse at any moment. A shot rang out deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. A bullet ricocheted off the rock near Scarlett's head. Jack pulled her behind a pillar of stone, pressing her back against the cold wall. I have to draw them away, he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. When I move, you run. Get out of here. No, she whispered back fiercely. I'm not leaving you. Before he could argue, a beam of light from a lantern cut through the darkness, pinning them. It was Miller, a triumphant grin on his face. Nowhere left to run. But from a side tunnel, another figure emerged. Silas Kane. The marshal is mine, Miller, he commanded. In that moment of distraction, Jack acted. He shoved Scarlett hard into another intersecting tunnel and charged not at Miller, but at the main support beam near the entrance, throwing his full weight against the rotting wood. With a great groan, the beam splintered. The roof of the mine began to collapse, rock and earth cascading down, sealing the entrance in a cloud of dust and debris. They were all trapped. The fight devolved into a primal struggle for survival in the suffocating darkness. Gunshots lit the chaos in brief, violent flashes. Scarlett, separated from Jack, pressed herself into a small alcove, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could hear the fight, the grunts of effort, the sickening thud of fists on flesh. Someone screamed a short, sharp cry of pain that was abruptly cut off. A terrible silence fell, broken only by the dripping of water and the groaning of the mountain. Jack, she called out, her voice a trembling whisper. A figure stumbled toward her out of the dust. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it was Kane. But it was Jack, battered and bruised, his arm bleeding freely but alive. He was holding a lantern he'd taken from one of the men. Miller and his men are down, he said, his voice ragged. But Kane, as if summoned, Kane appeared at the far end of the tunnel, framed by the lantern light. He was alone, his silver-plated revolver held steady. He looked not at Jack, but at Scarlett. This is between us now. he said, his voice strangely calm. "The law failed me. Vengeance is all I have left." He raised his pistol to fire at Jack. But Scarlet was faster. She had retrieved her Colt during the chaos. She raised it with both hands, the training Jack had given her taking over. She aimed at the center of Kane's chest and fired. The shot was deafening. Kane staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his own pistol clattering to the ground. He stared at her, not with hatred, but with a look of profound, weary surprise. He was wounded, disarmed, defeated. Scarlet walked toward him. The gun still raised, her finger tight on the trigger. All the pain, the grief, the rage of the past weeks coalesced into this single moment. She could end it. She could pull the trigger and avenge her father. It would be justice. Do it. Kane rasped, a faint mocking smile on his lips. Become a killer like him. Let vengeance be your law. His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She looked from Kane's face to the gun in her hand, then to Jack. She saw her father's face in her mind, heard his voice speaking of the sanctity of the law, the line between justice and revenge. To kill this man now in cold blood would be to betray everything her father had lived and died for. It would make his death meaningless. Her hand trembled. With a deep, shuddering breath, she lowered the gun. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong in the echoing darkness. "My father believed in the law. I'll see you hang by it." At that moment, the mountain gave a final agonized groan. The tunnel they were in began to collapse. Jack grabbed her, pulling her back as the ceiling caved in, burying Silas Kane under tons of rock and earth. A final, silent judgment, delivered not by a bullet, but by the mountain itself. They emerged from a secondary air shaft into the clean, rain-washed air of dawn. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured and new. They stood for a long moment, bruised, battered, but alive, breathing in the scent of wet sage and pine. The silence was a balm. The return to Silver Creek was a slow, painful journey. They brought with them the bodies of Sheriff Miller and his men, grim proof of the conspiracy. The townspeople, emerging from their homes to find their trusted lawman dead and exposed as a traitor, were stunned into silence. Jack, standing before the deputy and the town council, gave a full and public testimony. He hid nothing. He spoke of the raid 10 years ago, of Daniel Kane's death, of the guilt he had carried ever since. He took responsibility for his role in the tragedy that had birthed a monster and corrupted a town. It was not an apology or an excuse. It was a confession, a final painful lancing of a wound that had festered for a decade. He laid down his past, not for judgment, but simply as the truth. Months passed. The federal marshals came and went, their investigation confirming every word of Jack's testimony. The story of the corrupt sheriff and the ghost of the Cimarron became a local legend. Silver Creek began to heal, its foundations shaken, but ultimately reset on a firmer ground of truth. Jack was cleared of any official wrongdoing. Yet the old inquiry files reopened and then closed for good. The U.S. Marshals, impressed by his actions, offered him his badge back. An offer of reinstatement, of a return to the life he had lost. He turned it down. On a cool autumn afternoon, he took Scarlet to the small cemetery overlooking the town. They stood before two graves. One was newly marked, belonging to her father, his body having been brought from Redemption for a proper burial. The other was a simple wooden cross. Jack had carved himself, bearing a single name, Daniel Kane. From his pocket, Jack took a small tarnished silver star, his old marshal's badge. He held it in his palm, the symbol of his failure, his guilt, and the life he could no longer lead. For a long moment he stared at it, the weight of his past resting in his hand. He didn't throw it away into the canyon in a grand cliché gesture. Instead, he turned to Scarlet and held it out to her. She looked at him, her emerald eyes filled with a deep, quiet understanding. "The past is a part of us," he said, his voice rough with emotion. But it doesn't have to be a prison. She accepted the star, her fingers closing around the worn metal. It was not a promise of a perfect future, but an acceptance of a fractured past, a shared truth that had forged them together in the crucible of violence and grief. They had both lost their fathers to the same long, dark shadow. They had faced the ghost together and survived. They walked away from the graves, not toward an idyllic hidden valley to hide from the world, but back toward the town, toward the future. They would build a new life, not in spite of their scars, but because of them. Their journey was not over. It was just beginning.